The first bone came up wrong. Sybil knew it before Caleb even pulled it free from the red Mississippi clay. Knew it by the way the earth seemed to exhale as the shovel broke through, by the sudden absence of birdsong, by the taste of copper that flooded her mouth, though she stood 30 feet away with water buckets hanging from her shoulders. The bone emerged slowly, reluctant, clutched between the shovel's teeth like something that had been holding on tight to the darkness below. Caleb held it up to examine. In the afternoon light, it looked almost ordinary. Almost. Sybil's hands tightened on the bucket handles. The water inside began to ripple, though there was no wind, forming concentric circles that pulsed outward from the center like a heartbeat made visible. She set the buckets down carefully, slowly, the way her grandmother had taught her to move when spirits were watching. Around the excavation site, the other slaves had stopped working. Their shovels hung suspended, dirt clinging to the blades. Moses, who'd been digging since sunup without pause, now stood perfectly still, sweat running down his face in rivers, but his body frozen like he'd been carved from the same red clay they were moving. Little Thomas, barely 12, had backed away from the hole until his shoulders pressed against the tool shed, his eyes wide and white. They felt it too, the wrongness, the way the air had changed weight. I said, "Keep digging." Caleb's voice cut through the stillness. He tossed the bone aside. It landed in the grass with a sound too heavy for something so small, and drove his shovel back into the earth. "Mr. Crawford wants this cellar dug by week's end, and by God you'll—" The shovel hit something solid. Not rock, not root. Something that made a sound like breaking pottery, like shattering glass, like a door being opened that should have stayed shut. Sybil felt it in her chest. A reverberation, a note struck in a key that human ears weren't meant to hear, but human bones recognized anyway. Her grandmother's voice whispered up from memory. "When the earth speaks, child, you listen, and when it screams, you run." This was somewhere between the two. By the time the sun began its descent toward the tree line, turning the sky the color of a healing bruise, they'd uncovered a collection that Caleb arranged on the grass like trophies. Pottery shards decorated with spirals that seemed to move when Sybil wasn't looking directly at them. Arrowheads of black flint that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. A clay bowl, somehow intact, with residue still coating the inside. Something dark and organic that smelled of tobacco and blood and ceremonies conducted under different stars. Choctaw. The word moved through the slave quarters that evening like smoke, whispered from mouth to ear, carried on exhaled breath. The departed people, the ones who'd walked the crying road westward 40 years back, driven off land that had held their bones for 1,000 years before white men decided it should hold cotton instead. Sybil had heard the stories. Everyone had. Her grandmother used to tell them on nights when the wind came from the wrong direction, when the swamp mist crawled up from the lowlands thick enough to touch. Stories of curses laid down in languages that predated English, of promises made by dying medicine men that the land would remember, would repay, would reclaim. White folks called them fairy tales. Sybil's people knew better. She didn't go to the big house that evening. Couldn't. Her feet wouldn't carry her past the excavation site, and when she tried to force them, her vision swam, and her stomach lurched, and her grandmother's voice rose up so loud inside her skull, she had to press her palms against her temples. "Not yet, child, not yet. Watch first, see what comes." So she watched. From the window of the quarters she shared with 3 other house slaves, she kept vigil as darkness swallowed the plantation. The hole gaped like a mouth in the earth, deeper now than a root cellar needed to be. Caleb had gotten ambitious in those final hours, driven by something that might have been enthusiasm but looked more like compulsion. He dug and dug, throwing dirt over his shoulder in great arcs, and the other slaves had stepped back and let him, their faces carefully blank in that way that came from years of knowing when to make yourself invisible. The quarter moon rose, thin as a fingernail paring. Sybil pressed her forehead against the rough wood of the window frame and felt her heartbeat in her temples, in her throat, in her fingertips, waiting. The air had gone very still, the way it did before a summer storm, but the sky remained clear. Somewhere in the darkness, a mule screamed. The sound cut through the night like a blade, raw and terrified and wrong in a way that made Sybil's skin prickle. Mules didn't scream like that. Mules didn't scream like anything human, like something dying badly, like something that understood what was happening to it and begged the darkness for mercy. Then silence. So complete. It felt like deafness. Sybil's hand went to the small leather pouch that hung between her breasts, hidden beneath her shift. Her fingers traced its familiar contours, the graveyard dirt from her grandmother's resting place, still warm no matter how many years passed. The silver dime with a hole worn through its center by her grandmother's thumb, rubbed smooth over decades of prayer. The three Job's tears, seeds that rattled softly when she moved, their sound like distant rain. Protection, or the memory of it, or the hope. She waited until the first hint of gray touched the eastern horizon before moving. The other women in the quarters were awake. Sarah sat on her pallet with her knees drawn to her chest. Dinah rocked slowly back and forth, humming a hymn under her breath. Old Esther stood at the door as if guarding against something only she could see. None of them spoke. There were no words for what they'd heard. Sybil slipped out into the pre-dawn darkness, her bare feet silent on the packed dirt path that led to the stables. The air tasted of ozone and something else, something organic and ancient, like the smell that rose from the swamp when the water was low and old things lay exposed to air for the first time in centuries. The stable door hung open. It shouldn't have been. Caleb was meticulous about the animals, whatever his other faults, and he locked those doors every night without fail because Mr. Crawford counted every horse, every mule, every chicken like they were gold coins. Sybil's breath came shallow as she stepped inside. The mule lay in its stall, rigid as stone, its neck arched backward at an angle that spoke of agony in its final moments. White foam had dried in crusty ribbons around its mouth. Its eyes had rolled back, showing crescents of white that seemed to glow in the dim light filtering through gaps in the stable walls. But it was the hooves that stopped Sybil's heart. The iron shoes had melted. Not completely, but enough. They'd fused partially with the wooden floor, creating strange hybrid shapes that were neither metal nor wood, but something in between. The planks around them showed no char, no scorch marks, no evidence of flame. Just wood that had gone soft enough for iron to sink into it like mud, then hardened again, trapping the metal halfway through. Sybil knelt beside the corpse. Her hand hovered over its flank, hesitating. She'd helped birth this mule 3 years back, had fed it apples from the orchard when no one was looking, had whispered to it in the quiet language reserved for animals and small children. It had been called Jasper. Now it was just meat that held heat it shouldn't hold, warmth that radiated not from life, but from something that had passed through and left its mark. She touched its side. The warmth moved, shifted beneath the skin like water in a bladder, gathering under her palm, pressing back against her touch. Not the warmth of a dying body cooling slowly, the warmth of swamp lights, of graveyard mist, of things that moved in darkness wearing shapes that weren't their own. Sybil jerked her hand back and stumbled to her feet, her heart hammering against her ribs. The mule's eye rotated in its socket. The motion was slight, so slight she might have imagined it, but the eye definitely moved, tracking her as she backed toward the door despite being very clearly dead, despite rigor mortis having already set in. She ran. The morning bell rang as she reached the quarters, its sound flat and wrong in air that seemed to swallow noise rather than carry it. The slaves emerged slowly from their cabins, moving like people in a dream, their faces closed and careful. They knew. All of them knew. You didn't survive on a plantation without developing senses that went beyond sight and hearing, without learning to read signs that white folks walked right past. Something had changed. Something had broken. Something had begun. Sybil stood near the well, her hands still shaking, watching the excavation site. In daylight it looked innocent enough. Just a hole in the ground. Just displaced earth. Just the normal violence of land being reshaped to human will. But she could see the shimmer in the air above it, the way the heat didn't rise quite right, the way shadows fell at angles that didn't match the sun's position. The bell rang again. Time to begin work. Time to pretend normalcy while the world tilted sideways. Sybil picked up her water buckets. The water inside had gone cloudy overnight, brown like creek mud, though it had been clear when she'd drawn it. She dumped it out. The liquid hit the ground and immediately soaked in, vanishing faster than water should, like the earth was desperately thirsty, like it was drinking. From the big house, she heard Mr. Crawford shouting for his breakfast. From the fields, the overseer's whistle signaling assembly. From the stables, young Marcus emerged stumbling, his face the color of ashes, his mouth working soundlessly. And from the excavation site, if she listened very carefully beneath all those human sounds, Sybil could hear breathing. Deep, slow, patient. The breathing of something that had been asleep for a very long time and was now, incrementally, waking up. The day passed in a fever dream. Sybil moved through her tasks with mechanical precision, hauling water, beating rugs, scrubbing floors, while her mind raced in circles like a bird trapped in a room. The other house slaves gave her wide berth. They could see it on her, whatever she'd brought back from the stable. Fear had a smell, and Sybil reeked of it. By midday, the heat had become oppressive. Not the normal Mississippi summer heat that pressed down like a wet blanket, but something heavier, something that seemed to rise from the ground rather than descend from the sun. The air rippled and shimmered. Dogs crawled under porches and refused to emerge. Chickens stopped pecking and stood motionless in their yard, heads cocked as if listening to sounds beyond human hearing. Mr. Crawford seemed oblivious. He spent the morning on the veranda drinking whiskey and reviewing ledgers, occasionally shouting orders about the cellar construction. He wanted it finished. He wanted it deep. He wanted storage for the winter provisions, for the sweet potatoes and turnips, for the salted pork and preserved fruits. He wanted dominion over the earth, same as he had dominion over everything else on his land. The earth, Sybil thought as she scrubbed his floors, was preparing to teach him different. It happened at precisely 2 o'clock. She knew because the grandfather clock in the hall had just chimed, its bells sounding muffled and distant as if ringing underwater. Little Ezra, who'd been playing in the yard with the other slave children, stopped mid-step. His body went rigid, arms locked at his sides, head tilted at an unnatural angle. The other children backed away slowly, instinctively, their play forgotten. Sybil dropped her scrub brush and ran, her wet hands leaving prints on the walls as she pushed through the door. By the time she reached the yard, Ezra was speaking, but the voice wasn't his. It poured from his 6-year-old mouth like water from a broken dam, words in a language that predated English, that predated the ships, that predated everything Sybil knew. The syllables were sharp and liquid simultaneously, consonants that clicked against teeth, vowels that resonated from somewhere deep in the chest. The voice layered over itself, multiple tones speaking in unison, creating harmonics that made Sybil's teeth ache. The words meant nothing to her ears but everything to her bones. They spoke of territory, of violation, of sleep interrupted and patience ending and debts coming due. Ezra's eyes had gone completely black, not just the pupils but the whites, the irises, everything swallowed by darkness so complete it seemed to pull light into itself. Tears ran down his face in clear rivers, but his expression remained blank, empty, like a house with nobody home. Sybil grabbed his shoulders. The child's skin burned fever-hot through his thin shirt. "Release him," she whispered. Then louder, in the old words her grandmother had taught her, the ones that tasted of iron and earth and salt. "Release this child. He is not yours. He is protected. He is covered. He is—" The voice stopped mid-syllable. The silence was so abrupt, it felt violent. Ezra blinked once, twice, and the blackness drained from his eyes like ink in water, leaving behind only the normal brown irises of a terrified little boy. He looked up at Sybil, his face crumpling. "Miss Sybil," he whimpered, "I dreamed I was underwater, and someone was angry I woke up." His mother ran forward and snatched him into her arms, backing away from the excavation site while making the sign against evil with her free hand. The other children scattered like birds, disappearing into quarters and under porches and behind sheds. Sybil stood alone in the yard, her hands still extended where they'd gripped Ezra's shoulders, feeling the residual heat fade from her palms. The sun beat down mercilessly, but she felt cold, bone-deep cold, the kind that came from standing too close to something that belonged in darkness. Around her feet, the grass had turned brown in a perfect circle, dead, as if her presence, her intervention, had scorched the life from it. She looked at her hands. They appeared normal, but when she pressed them together, palm to palm, she felt the pulse between them, the current, the connection that ran from her blood back through her mother's blood, back through her grandmother's blood, back across the ocean to sources and origins and powers that had survived the Middle Passage by hiding in heartbeats and hummed lullabies. She was awake now, too. Whatever had been sleeping inside her, passed down through generations of women who knew how to speak to things that shouldn't be spoken to. It was stirring, responding, preparing. The land had called. Her blood had answered. And there was no going back from that. Night fell like a guillotine blade, swift and final. One moment the sun stained the horizon red as a wound. The next moment darkness swallowed everything except the thin sliver of moon and the oil lamps burning in the big house windows. Sybil sat on the floor of her quarters, her back against the wall, her eyes fixed on the gap between the wooden slats. Through it, she could see the excavation site, a deeper darkness against the dark, and beyond that, the tree line where the swamp began its slow encroachment on cultivated land. The other women had given up pretending to sleep. Sarah sat on her pallet, braiding and unbraiding her hair in an endless nervous rhythm. Dinah hummed hymns under her breath, cycling through every song she knew and starting over. Old Esther had positioned herself at the door again, her gnarled hands gripping a broom handle like it was a spear, like it could defend against what was coming. "You seen this before?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "Your grandmother ever speak of this?" Sybil nodded slowly. She called it the settling, when disturbed earth tries to balance itself, when the dead remember they have claims the living forgot about. How long it lasts? Until it's fed or fought. And which one we doing? That was the question, wasn't it? Sybil's hand went to the pouch at her chest, her fingers automatically finding the familiar shapes inside. Her grandmother had taught her root work, how to make a person love you, how to make them leave you alone, how to protect a house from evil intentions, how to send curses that clung like tar. Small magics, personal magics, human magics. This was something else. This was land magic, spirit magic. The kind that required sacrifices her grandmother had only spoken of in hushed tones, late at night, in the language that wasn't quite English and wasn't quite anything else. The Creole tongue that belonged to crossroads and midnight and deals made with things that had never been human. To fight this, she would need 4 things. The knowledge rose unbidden from memory, her grandmother's voice overlaying her own thoughts. Graveyard dirt gathered at midnight when the moon is dark, hair from the head of whoever claims ownership of the desecrated ground, a living sacrifice willingly given, and words spoken in the tongue of the original dead. Sybil had the first. Dirt from her grandmother's grave was already in her pouch. The second would be dangerous but possible. She cleaned Mr. Crawford's bedroom. She could collect hair from his brush. The third made her stomach turn, but she knew the old ways, knew that living sacrifice didn't always mean death. Could mean blood, could mean promise, could mean offering up something precious. But the fourth, the words, the language of the Choctaw dead who lay beneath Caleb's shovel. Those words she didn't have, had no way of getting, no means of learning. Unless, through the gap in the wall, lights appeared. They drifted up from the swamp like embers rising from a fire, but these flames burned green-blue, cold colors, wrong colors. Will-o-wisps, swamp lights, ghost fires. They had a dozen names and one meaning. Spirits abroad, the boundaries thinning, the world turning translucent. Sybil counted them. 1, 2, 5, 10, 20. More appearing every moment, floating across the fields toward the plantation in a slow processional, a funeral march, a gathering of witnesses. They reached the boundary where cultivated land met wild growth and stopped, hovering, waiting, testing the edges like wolves circling a camp, like water finding cracks in a dam. Sarah's braiding rhythm faltered. "Sweet Jesus." "Jesus ain't here tonight," Esther said flatly, her grip tightening on the broom. "This is older business than him." The lights pulsed. Once, twice, 3 times. A rhythm, a heartbeat. A pattern that Sybil recognized from her grandmother's teachings. The knock of spirits requesting entry. The polite inquiry before the violent intrusion. The moment when power asks permission before taking what it wants anyway. Sybil stood. Her legs felt unsteady, but she moved to the door, pushed past Esther's restraining hand, stepped out into the night. The air was wrong. Too thick, too warm. It pressed against her skin like wet cloth, and when she breathed it tasted of copper and tobacco smoke and something organic that reminded her of the smell that rose from the swamp in summer when the water was low and things rotted in the mud. The lights watched her. 40 of them now. 50. More. An audience, a jury, a congregation of the dead. Sybil raised her hands, palms out, empty. The gesture her grandmother had taught her meant peace, meant respect, meant I see you and acknowledge your right to be angry. For a long moment, nothing. Just the lights hovering, just the night breathing. Then, from the excavation site, something laughed. Not a human laugh, not an animal sound. Something between. Something that had forgotten what joy sounded like but remembered the shape of it, the mechanics, and recreated it with parts that didn't quite fit together right. The laugh echoed across the fields, bounced off the big house walls, reverberated in Sybil's chest like a second heartbeat. Wrong rhythm, wrong tempo, wrong everything. And beneath it, under the laughter, Sybil heard breathing. Deep, slow, patient, closer now than before. The thing in the ground was waking up, and it was hungry. Sybil pressed her palm against the wall of the quarters and whispered the only protection prayer she knew by heart, the words her grandmother had made her memorize before she could read, before she could write, before she could do anything else. By the blood that crossed the water, by the names we kept when they tried to take them, by the power that survived the ships, by the spirits that guide us still. I draw the line. I hold the boundary. I say not here, not tonight, not yet. The lights flickered, hesitated, then moved closer, 10 feet nearer, then 20, crossing the boundary between wild and cultivated, between theirs and stolen, between then and now. Sybil's prayer died in her throat. It wasn't enough. Her small magic against their old rage. It was like trying to stop a flood with a teacup. The lights reached the cotton fields and the plants began to die. Not wilt, not wither. Just die instantly, going from green to brown to black in seconds. The change racing through the crop in waves, spreading outward from each light like ripples in water. Mr. Crawford's fortune, turning to ash before her eyes. Months of labor, destroyed in moments. The other slaves would be blamed. Whipped, sold, killed. Because white men needed someone to punish, and it would never be the spirits, would never be the land itself, would always be the bodies they could reach. Unless she stopped it, unless she fought, unless she became what her grandmother had been preparing her to become since she was old enough to understand that some battles weren't fought with fists or words, but with will and blood, and the power that ran in veins and remembered older names for God. Sybil stepped forward, away from the quarters, away from safety. Her bare feet found the path between the slave cabins and the fields. Behind her, she heard Sarah gasp, heard Esther curse, heard voices calling her back. She didn't turn. Couldn't. Every step toward the lights felt like walking through water, like the air itself was becoming substance, resistance, a wall she had to push through. Her grandmother's voice rose up from memory, stronger now, clearer. When the spirits come, child, you don't run, you don't hide. You meet them standing. You meet them knowing who you are and what you carry. You meet them as a daughter of the power, a keeper of the knowledge, a worker of the roots. You meet them as equal. 20 feet from the nearest light, Sybil stopped. Center framed her view of the ghost fire center, framed her view of the ghost fire beyond. I see you, she said, her voice steady despite the fear turning her blood to ice water. I acknowledge you. I honor your anger. I recognize your claim. The light stopped advancing. The cotton stopped dying, the wave of destruction pausing mid-spread. Sybil took a breath and continued, pulling words from some deep place inside herself, some reservoir of knowledge she didn't know she possessed. But these people are not your enemies. These bodies you would destroy are as violated as your graves. These hands that dug were forced to dig. We are all buried here. Different depths, same earth. Silence. The night held its breath. Then, from the excavation site, that voice. The one that had spoken through little Ezra. The one that was many voices, old voices, voices that had cursed this land as they were driven from it. The earth remembers. The earth requires. The earth will have what it is owed. Yes, Sybil said, but let it take from those who took from it. Let it claim the claimers. Let it have what it's actually owed, not the nearest bodies, not us, not the ones who were brought here in chains, same as you were driven away in them. A pause, the lights hovering, considering. Sybil could feel the weight of their attention, could feel the dead examining her, measuring her, determining whether her words held truth or just the desperate lies of the living trying to survive. Then, one by one, the lights withdrew. Not disappearing, just pulling back to the boundary line. Waiting, watching, their message clear. We hear you, we will wait. But not forever, and the debt must still be paid. The breathing from the excavation site continued. Deeper now, more regular. The rhythm of something settling into wakefulness, taking stock of its new awareness, preparing for what came next. Sybil stood in the field, surrounded by half-dead cotton, and understood with terrible clarity what had to happen. The spirit in the ground wanted blood, wanted balance, wanted the scales set right. She had bought time, not mercy, bought days, maybe hours, not salvation. And when the dead came again, and they would come again, they would not be so easily reasoned with. Behind her, the quarter bell rang midnight, though no one had touched it. The sound echoed wrong, metallic and distant, like it was ringing in some other world, and only the echo reached this one. Sybil walked back to the quarters on legs that barely held her. Sarah and Esther pulled her inside, and Dinah threw a blanket around her shoulders, though the night was warm. They asked no questions. Some things were better left unspoken. Through the gap in the wall, Sybil watched the lights maintaining their vigil at the field's edge. 43 of them. She counted. 43 spirits who had answered the excavation's call. 43 dead who remembered and wanted and waited. And beneath them all, beneath the fields and the quarters and the big house and everything Mr. Crawford called his, something was waking up that had been sleeping since before the cotton, before the plantation, before the theft of land and the breaking of treaties and the long walk westward. The Choctaw called it many things. The spirit of place. The guardian of bones. The thing that lived where the dead were honored and woke when they were violated. Sybil's grandmother had another name for it. spoken in the Creole tongue that mixed 3 languages and belonged to none. The settler. Not something that settled land, but something that settled debts, that balanced scales, that took from the living what the living had taken from the dead. It was awake now, or waking. The difference wouldn't matter for long. And Sybil, whether she wanted to be or not, whether she was ready or not, was the only thing standing between it and everyone she'd ever known. She closed her eyes, but didn't sleep. Behind her eyelids, she saw her grandmother's face, heard her grandmother's voice. Every power has a price, child. Every gift demands payment. You want to be a root worker, you got to know. Someday the roots will work you. The price was coming due. And dawn, when it came, would bring no comfort. Caleb's body was discovered at dawn by his own dog. The hound came limping back to the overseer's cabin just as the first gray light touched the eastern sky, whimpering in a way that dogs shouldn't whimper, high and broken, almost human. It collapsed on the porch steps and refused to move, refused to eat. Just lay there shaking and staring back toward the fields with eyes that had seen something no animal should see. Sybil heard about it third hand, the news traveling through the plantation's invisible network faster than any bell could ring. She was in the big house kitchen, her hands deep in bread dough, when young Thomas burst through the door with a message barely coherent on his lips. The words tumbled out wrong, backwards, his fear scrambling the syntax until all that remained was the essential truth. Caleb was dead, and it was bad, and someone needed to come. She went because Mr. Crawford ordered it, because among the house slaves she was known to be steady-handed, calm in crisis, the one who didn't faint at blood or vomit at the sight of injury. Because her grandmother had been the plantation's unofficial healer before the fever took her, and some of that knowledge had transferred through blood and observation and long nights learning which herbs stopped bleeding and which ones invited it. But mostly she went because she needed to see, needed to know what the waking thing had done, needed to understand the shape of its hunger. The excavation site had changed overnight. The hole was deeper, impossibly deeper, as if the earth had continued digging itself in the darkness, pulling its own substance downward, creating a throat that descended far beyond what Caleb's shovel could have reached. The edges had collapsed inward in places, creating a spiral pattern that looked almost intentional, almost designed, almost like the symbols on the pottery shards that now lay scattered around the perimeter, arranged in a circle that Sybil recognized from her grandmother's teachings. Not scattered, placed. Caleb lay at the bottom. Sybil stood at the edge and looked down, her hand pressed against her mouth to hold back the sound that wanted to escape. The sun was rising behind her, sending her shadow stretching long across the disturbed earth, but the light didn't seem to reach the bottom of the hole. It stopped halfway down, as if the darkness there was thicker than ordinary shadow, as if it had substance and weight and the ability to resist illumination. But she could see enough. Caleb's body had been twisted, not broken, twisted like wet cloth wrung out by strong hands, his spine curved in ways that spines didn't curve, his limbs wrapped around themselves in configurations that suggested bones had become temporarily soft, malleable, reshaped, and then allowed to harden again in their new, impossible angles. His eyes were open. Even from this distance, even through the unnatural darkness, Sybil could see that. Open and staring upward, locked in an expression that went beyond fear into something that looked almost like understanding. Like he'd seen something in those final moments that explained everything and made it worse. His mouth was full of dirt. It spilled from his lips, packed his cheeks, bulged his throat. Red Mississippi clay forced down his windpipe while he was still alive. The scattered evidence of struggle around him told that story. He'd clawed at the ground, at his own face, had tried to dig it out or dig himself free, but the earth had been faster, hungrier, more determined. The land had fed. Jesus Christ! Mr. Crawford's voice came from behind her, rough with whiskey and early morning and the particular strain that came from seeing something that violated the natural order. Jesus fucking Christ, what happened to him? Sybil didn't answer. Couldn't. Her throat had closed around words that had nowhere to go. Around her, the gathered slaves stood in a silent semicircle, their faces carefully blank in that way that meant they were hiding terror behind the mask of servitude. They knew. All of them knew. You didn't survive on a plantation without learning to recognize when the world had shifted sideways, when the rules had changed, when something larger and more terrible than human cruelty was moving through the landscape. Mr. Crawford climbed down into the hole, not all the way, just far enough to confirm what his eyes were telling him from above. He crouched beside Caleb's body, touched the cold skin, examined the unnatural angles, the dirt-packed mouth, the fingers worn bloody from clawing. When he climbed back up, his face had gone the color of spoiled milk. "Accident," he said, his voice too loud, too insistent. "Goddamn fool must have been digging at night, drunk probably, and the sides collapsed. Suffocated. Terrible thing, terrible, but an accident. Just an accident." Nobody spoke. The silence stretched thin and taut as wire. Even Mr. Crawford seemed to hear the hollowness in his own words, but he clung to them anyway because the alternative, that something else had happened, something that couldn't be explained by physics or reason or the normal operation of cause and effect, was unthinkable for a man who believed the world bent to his will. "Moses, Jacob, get down there and pull him out. We'll bury him by sundown. The rest of you, back to work. This doesn't change anything. The cellar still needs to be dug, just more carefully, with proper support beams. During daylight. Everyone understand?" The slaves nodded, a collective motion of submission that meant nothing and everything. They would nod and agree, and then they would do exactly as they'd been told while simultaneously doing everything in their power to avoid going near that hole, to keep their children away from it, to pretend compliance while practicing the careful art of survival. Sybil watched Moses and Jacob descend into the excavation with ropes and reluctance written into every movement. Watched them tie the ropes around Caleb's twisted corpse with hands that shook. Watched them try not to look at his face, at his dirt-filled mouth, at the way his body had been reshaped into something that was no longer quite human in its geometry. The ropes went taut. They pulled. The body didn't move. They pulled harder, putting their backs into it. Their feet braced against the sloped walls. The ropes creaked. Caleb's body remained motionless, as if it had been rooted to the earth, as if the ground had claimed him and wouldn't release its prize without a fight. "Pull, goddammit!" Mr. Crawford's face had gone red, veins standing out on his neck. "Put your backs into it, you lazy—" The body came free all at once, released so suddenly that Moses and Jacob stumbled backward. It rose through the darkness at the bottom of the hole like something surfacing from deep water, and as it emerged into sunlight, Sybil saw what had been hidden in shadow. Caleb's back was covered in handprints. Dozens of them. Scores of them. Pressed into his skin like brands, like the earth itself had reached up with countless palms and grabbed him, held him, pulled him down. The prints were too small to be adult hands, child-sized or smaller, the delicate finger marks of people long dead, buried deep, disturbed and angry. Sybil's breath stopped in her chest. She knew what this meant. Her grandmother had told stories about the Choctaw burial practices, how they wrapped their children with special care, placed them in the earth with ceremonies that lasted days, sang them into the next world with words that predated English and slavery and everything that came after. The idea that those small bones had been scattered by Caleb's shovel, those careful burials violated, those spirits sent wandering. The children had taken him first. Mr. Crawford saw the handprints. Sybil watched his face as comprehension tried to break through the wall of denial he'd constructed. Watched him look at those small palm marks pressed into dead flesh. Watched him open his mouth to speak. Watched him close it again because there were no words in his vocabulary for this. No framework in his worldview that could accommodate what his eyes were showing him. He turned away. Walked 3 steps. Stopped. His shoulders rose and fell with breathing that came too fast, too shallow. When he spoke, his voice had lost its certainty. "Cover him. Get him in the ground. Today." Then he was walking toward the big house, his stride too rigid, his hands clenched at his sides. A man fleeing without admitting he was fleeing. Moses and Jacob carried Caleb's body toward the overseer's plot, wrapped in canvas that barely concealed the unnatural angles underneath. The other slaves dispersed slowly, casting backward glances at the excavation site that yawned like a wound in the red earth. Sybil remained. She stood at the edge of the hole and looked down into darkness that pulsed with its own rhythm. The spirits had been waiting at the field's edge last night. She'd bought time with her words, with her acknowledgement of their claim. But Caleb's death changed everything. The spirits had tasted blood now, had remembered what vengeance felt like. And Mr. Crawford still wanted the cellar dug, still wanted to carve deeper into violated ground. Sybil's hand went to the pouch at her chest, the graveyard dirt, the silver dime, the job's tears, seeds. Her small protections felt pathetically inadequate against what was waking beneath her feet. She knelt and pressed her palm flat against the earth beside the excavation. The ground was warm, not sun-warm, but warm from below, fever-warm. She could feel the pulse through her skin, slow and steady like a heartbeat. A fragment of memory surfaced. Her grandmother years ago, kneeling in their small garden plot behind the quarters. Sybil couldn't have been more than 7, watching as the old woman dug a small hole and placed something inside. A lock of hair, a fingernail clipping, a scrap of cloth stained dark. "What are you doing, Grandma?" The old woman had looked up, her face serious in the lamplight. "Making a promise, child, to spirits that listen. Trading years I got left for power you gonna need." "What kind of power?" "The kind that stands between the living and the dead. The kind that costs." Her grandmother had covered the hole, patted the earth smooth. "You remember this place. When the time comes, you dig here. You'll find what I left for you." Sybil had forgotten, or thought she dreamed it. But now, kneeling beside the excavation with her palm against warming earth, she remembered with the clarity of something that had been waiting to be recalled. The garden plot, behind the quarters, where her grandmother used to grow herbs and whisper to the soil. Sybil stood and walked back toward the slave quarters, moving quickly but not running. Running drew attention. She needed to be invisible right now, needed to slip through the plantation's awareness like smoke. The garden plot was overgrown. No one had tended it since her grandmother died 3 years back. Weeds choked what had once been neat rows of medicinal plants. But Sybil remembered the spot, near the corner, beneath where the old magnolia tree's shadow fell at noon. She found a stick and began to dig. The earth gave way easily, too easily, like it had been waiting. 6 inches down, her stick hit something solid. She used her hands then, pulling away dirt until she uncovered a small clay jar, sealed with wax and wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow survived burial intact. Inside the jar, a lock of white hair, her grandmother's, a piece of birch bark covered in symbols that seemed to shift in the light, and a scrap of paper, the handwriting shaky but legible. "When the earth wakes, speak these words at the dark moon. Mix your blood with mine. The spirits know our bargain. They will listen to our blood if nothing else. The cost is paid. You need only complete the work. I love you, child. I'm sorry for the burden, but you're stronger than you know." Sybil's hands trembled as she held the paper. Her grandmother had known, had seen this coming, had paid in advance with years of life, with the fever that took her too young, with the sacrifice that bought Sybil the power to stand against what was waking. The cost was already paid, the debt already settled. All that remained was the completion. Sybil's blood, her words, her choice to stand as barrier. She folded the paper carefully and tucked it into her dress along with the birch bark and the lock of white hair. The jar she reburied, marking the spot with a small stone so she could find it again if needed. When she stood, she wasn't alone. Old Esther stood at the edge of the garden, leaning on her walking stick, her eyes sharp and knowing. Found what you were looking for? Sybil nodded slowly. Your grandmother told me, before she passed. Said you'd come digging when the time was right. Said I was to tell you. Esther paused, choosing words carefully. She said the spirits gave her a choice. 10 more years of life, or 10 years of power passed to you early. She chose you. Chose to die young so you'd be strong when this day came. The words landed like stones. Sybil had suspected, but hearing it confirmed, knowing her grandmother had looked at that choice and chosen to sacrifice herself, it made breathing difficult. She also said, Esther continued, that you'd feel guilty, feel like you owed her something, but you don't. She made her choice free and clear, said it was the best trade she ever made. The old woman's face softened slightly. You just have to make yours now. Stand or walk away. Fight or let the spirits take what they will. If I walk away, we all die. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow. But that thing waking under the ground, it won't stop with Caleb. Won't stop until the debt is paid in full. And the debt. Esther shook her head. The debt is bigger than you know. Bigger than this plantation. This is Choctaw land going back 1,000 years. White men think signing papers makes it theirs. The spirits no different. Sybil looked at the excavation site visible beyond the quarters, at the big house with its white columns, at the fields where slaves bent under the sun. All of it built on stolen ground. All of it standing on a foundation of violated graves and broken treaties. And beneath it all, something ancient waking up angry. The dark moon is 3 days from now, Sybil said quietly. Esther nodded. Then you got 3 days to prepare, to gather what you need, to make your peace with what comes after. What does come after? For you, same thing that came for your grandmother. The power don't come free, child. You use it, it uses you back. Takes years, takes strength, takes pieces of yourself you won't get back. Esther's grip tightened on her walking stick. But you'll save lives. You'll close the door. You'll send those children's spirits back to rest. That's worth something. Worth her life. Worth years she'd never get to live. Worth becoming something other than human, something in between, something that spoke to the dead and paid the price for that conversation. Sybil thought of her grandmother's face, of the stories told in the quarters, of the people who would die if she walked away. Thought of the children's handprints on Caleb's back, of spirits that deserved rest, of the balance that needed restoring. The choice was already made, had been made before she was born, in whatever bargain her grandmother struck. But it still needed to be spoken, claimed, made real by her own voice. I'll do it, Sybil said. 3 nights from now, at the dark moon. Esther nodded once, sharp and final. Then we best get you ready. Come nightfall, we'll talk about what you need, what words to say, how to make the binding hold. She turned to leave, then paused. Your grandmother would be proud, child. Scared for you, but proud. She left Sybil standing in the overgrown garden, holding her grandmother's final gift, feeling the weight of inherited power settling into her bones like fever, like fire, like the slow burn of sacrifice that would consume her from the inside out, but might save everyone else. 3 days. The big house beckoned. Sybil still needed Mr. Crawford's hair, that ingredient her grandmother couldn't provide in advance. The thought of entering his private space, of stealing from him, made her stomach turn. But the alternative was worse. She waited until afternoon, until the heat drove Mr. Crawford to his study for his daily whiskey and ledger review. The house slaves knew his patterns as well as they knew their own heartbeats. Survival depended on that knowledge. Sybil carried a basket of clean linens up the stairs, her footsteps soft on the polished wood. Mr. Crawford's bedroom door stood open. He rarely closed it during the day, too confident in his domain to imagine anyone might violate his space. She could hear him downstairs, his voice raised as he berated someone about crop yields. The sound gave her a timeline. 5 minutes, maybe 10, before he'd finish his tirade and pour another drink. The bedroom smelled of tobacco and stale sweat, and the particular musk of privilege. His hairbrush lay on the dresser, silver-backed and monogrammed, bristles dark with strands of thinning hair. Sybil's hand trembled as she reached for it. This was theft. If caught, she'd be whipped at minimum, sold at worst. Her fingers closed around 3 strands, 3 for the Trinity, 3 for strength, 3 because her grandmother had always used odd numbers for workings that needed to hold. The hairs came away easily. She tucked them into her palm, into the space between her lifeline and heart line, closing her fist around them. Behind her, a floorboard creaked. Her heart stopped. She turned slowly, expecting to see Mr. Crawford, expecting violence and punishment and the end of everything. But the doorway was empty. Just the house settling. Just her fear making ghosts out of shadows. She backed toward the door, the stolen hairs pressed into her palm like hot wire. Made it to the hallway, down the stairs, through the kitchen, out into the yard where the afternoon sun beat down merciless and ordinary. Only then did she allow herself to breathe. The hairs went into her pouch with the other ingredients. Graveyard dirt, silver dime, Job's tears, her grandmother's lock of white hair, the birch bark with its shifting symbols, and now 3 strands from the man who claimed ownership of desecrated ground. Almost everything she needed. Just one element missing, her own blood, willingly given. That would come on the dark moon, when she stood at the edge of the excavation and spoke words that would either bind the waking thing or release it fully. 3 days. The plantation held its breath. That was the only way Sybil could describe it. The normal rhythms continued. Work in the fields, meals in the quarters, commands from the big house. But underneath, attention vibrated like a plucked string. Caleb was buried that afternoon in a hurried ceremony. No overseer appeared to replace him. Mr. Crawford took to carrying a pistol on his belt, though what he thought to shoot remained unclear. The slaves moved through their tasks with eyes that constantly flicked toward the excavation site, toward the tree line, toward anywhere the spirits might manifest. The second death came at sunset. Thomas, young Thomas, who'd brought the news of Caleb's body, simply didn't come back from the fields. When the bell rang for evening meal, his absence became a presence, a gap in the normal order that everyone felt, but no one immediately named. Moses found him an hour later, near the irrigation ditch. Not dead. Worse. He was standing knee-deep in water that came only to his ankles, staring at nothing, his mouth moving in words that made no sound. When Moses tried to pull him out, the boy's skin was cold as clay, and he wouldn't bend, wouldn't move, just stood rigid as a fence post. 4 men finally lifted him bodily and carried him back to the quarters. They laid him on a pallet and covered him with blankets, but he remained cold, remained standing even while horizontal, his body locked in that upright position like he'd been frozen mid-step. His eyes were open but saw nothing. His lips moved but spoke silence. Sybil knelt beside him and placed her hand on his forehead. The cold went bone deep, and beneath it she felt something else, a presence, an awareness that wasn't Thomas, that looked out through Thomas's eyes and marked her as it had marked Caleb. "He's not in there anymore," she whispered. The boy's mother wailed, a sound that cut through the quarters and sent children scrambling for their parents. The men stood helpless, their hands opening and closing on nothing, their faces reflecting the terrible understanding that this was beyond whipping, beyond running, beyond anything human power could address. "Can you bring him back?" Moses's voice was rough with hope he didn't believe in. Sybil looked at Thomas's frozen face, at his moving lips, at the presence behind his eyes that watched and waited and hungered. She thought of the ritual, of the dark moon still 3 days away, of the binding that might stop this if she could just hold out long enough. "Not yet," she said, "but soon, 3 days. I can end this in 3 days. And if we don't have 3 days?" That was the question. The spirits were getting bolder, taking more, testing the boundaries of what they could claim. Caleb had been violent, deserved. But Thomas? Thomas was just a child who'd stumbled too close to the excavation, who'd looked too long into the darkness, who'd been claimed because he was available. The debt was accelerating, growing, spreading beyond the guilty to the merely present. Sybil stood and addressed the gathered slaves, her voice steadier than she felt. "Stay away from the excavation. Don't go near the fields after dark. Keep the children close. Pray if you know how, and if you don't, stay quiet and still. 3 days, that's all I need. 3 days, and I'll close the door they opened." "And if you can't?" someone asked from the back. Sybil met their eyes, all of them, letting them see the truth. "Then we all end up like Thomas, like Caleb, like anyone else the spirits decide to take." The silence that followed was absolute. Even Thomas's mother stopped wailing, her grief swallowed by the larger terror. Sybil walked out into the twilight, away from the quarters, toward the boundary where she'd stood 3 nights ago when the spirit lights first appeared. They were there again, hovering at the tree line. More of them now, 60, 70, an audience that grew nightly. She raised her hand in acknowledgement, in promise, in plea. 3 days, she whispered to the watching lights. "Give me 3 days. Then I'll give you what you're owed, balance for balance, blood for blood, just 3 more days." The lights pulsed, once, twice. To them carried the scent of the old woman, to them carried the scent of the old woman who'd bargained with them years ago, who'd paid in advance for this moment, who'd left power in her granddaughter's blood. 3 days. Sybil turned back toward the quarters where Thomas lay frozen, and Caleb's death lingered in memory, and fear made the air thick enough to touch. 3 days to prepare, to gather strength, to make peace with what the ritual would cost. 3 days until the dark moon rose over stolen ground, and Sybil would stand at the edge of the excavation with her grandmother's words on her lips and her own blood in her palm. 3 days until she became the wall her people needed, or died trying. The quarters were lamplit when she returned. Sarah had saved her a bowl of soup. Dinah hummed hymns. Esther stood at the door with her walking stick, guarding against things that came in darkness. And in the corner, Thomas lay frozen, his lips still moving in silent communion with whatever had taken residence behind his eyes. Sybil sat on her pallet and unwrapped the birch bark, studying the symbols by candlelight. The words looked impossible. Consonants that didn't belong in English, vowels that required throat positions she'd never made. But her grandmother had left phonetic guides, had written out the sounds as best she could. 3 days to learn a dead language. 3 days to prepare for sacrifice. 3 days to become something more than human and less than whole. Outside, the excavation breathed, deep and steady and patient, waiting for the dark moon, waiting for Sybil, waiting for the moment when the door would either close forever or open wide enough to swallow everything. 3 days. The dark moon rose invisible behind clouds thick as cotton. Sybil stood at the window of the quarters, watching the sky darken from twilight gray to absolute black. No stars, no silver crescent, just the weight of absence, the particular darkness that came when the moon turned its face away and left the world to older illuminations. 3 days had passed like fever dreams. Thomas remained frozen on his pallet, his body cold and rigid, his lips moving in that silent recitation of words no living tongue should speak. His mother sat beside him in constant vigil, her hands clutching his, her prayers whispered in exhaustion. Twice more his eyes had opened, black as the excavation's depths, and looked at Sybil with recognition that wasn't his own. The thing inside him was watching, waiting, marking time until the barrier between worlds thinned enough for it to push through completely. 2 more slaves had disappeared. Not died, just gone. Moses found their tools abandoned mid-row in the cotton field, found footprints that led toward the excavation, and then simply stopped, as if the people making them had been lifted into air or pulled beneath earth. Mr. Crawford ordered searches. The dogs refused to track, tucking tails and whimpering at the edge of the excavation site before retreating to the safety of their kennels. The third day, the crops began to die. Not wither, die instantly, the way they had when the spirit lights crossed into the fields. But this was worse, more complete. The plants turned black from root to bole, the change spreading in concentric circles, emanating from the excavation like ripples in water. By sunset, half the cotton lay dead in neat geometric patterns that suggested intention, design, a message written in ruined harvest. Mr. Crawford had locked himself in his study with a case of whiskey and his ledgers, calculating losses that mounted with every hour. Sybil had seen him through the window, his hands shaking as he added figures that refused to make sense, that documented the slow collapse of everything he believed he owned. The plantation was dying, and tonight, Sybil would either save it or die with it. She turned from the window. The other women in the quarters pretended to be busy. Sarah mending clothes she'd mended twice already. Dinah humming hymns that had lost their rhythm. Esther standing sentinel at the door with a grip on her walking stick that had turned her knuckles pale. They knew. Everyone knew. Tonight the root worker's granddaughter would walk to the excavation site and speak to the thing that lived beneath the ground. Would offer blood and binding and words in a language older than English. Would attempt to close the door that Caleb's shovel had opened. Would succeed or fail, live or die. There was no middle ground, no partial victory, no compromise with spirits who'd been waiting decades for this moment of reckoning. Sybil gathered her ingredients. The small clay jar that held graveyard dirt from her grandmother's resting place. She could feel warmth radiating through the ceramic, ancestral power that hadn't diminished with death. The silver dime with its worn-through center, polished until it caught what little light the candles provided. 3 Job's tears seeds that rattled softly when she moved them. The lock of her grandmother's white hair, still somehow vital, still holding the essence of the woman who'd sacrificed 10 years of life for this moment. The 3 strands from Mr. Crawford's brush, taken from the head of the man who claimed ownership of violated ground. The birch bark covered in symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in candlelight. Phonetic guides to a dead language that Sybil had spent 3 days learning to pronounce, her throat aching from unfamiliar sounds, her tongue twisted around syllables that belonged to different mouths. And finally, the knife. Small, sharp, borrowed from the kitchen under the pretense of cutting herbs. She'd honed it until the edge would part skin with barely any pressure, for the final ingredient. For her blood, willingly given, mixed with earth and intention. Everything prepared, everything ready, except Sybil herself, whose hands trembled as she tucked the ingredients into the deep pockets of her dress, whose breathing came shallow and fast, whose heart hammered against ribs that felt too fragile to contain it. You don't have to do this alone. Esther's voice, quiet but firm. Sybil turned to find the old woman standing close, her walking stick set aside, her gnarled hands extended. The ritual. I know what the ritual requires. 1 voice, 1 blood, 1 worker standing at the threshold. Esther's face was deeply lined, weathered by decades of sun and suffering and the particular exhaustion that came from surviving slavery. But walking there, standing witness, keeping watch while you work, that we can do, that we should do. Around the quarters, the other women nodded. Sarah set down her needlework. Dinah stopped humming. Even Thomas's mother looked up from her vigil, her face haggard but determined. We can't let you walk into that darkness alone, child, Dinah said softly. Your grandmother wouldn't forgive us. We wouldn't forgive ourselves. Something in Sybil's chest loosened slightly. She'd been prepared to do this isolated, singular, standing as solitary barrier between the living and the dead. But the offer of presence, of witness, of company, even if they couldn't share the burden, it made breathing easier. Stay at the edge then, Sybil said. Don't come close to the excavation. Don't speak once the working begins. And if... She paused, making herself say it. If something goes wrong, if I fail, run. Don't try to help. Just run and don't look back. Esther's jaw set in that stubborn expression that meant she'd agree to the letter of instruction while ignoring the spirit entirely. But she nodded, and that would have to be enough. They emerged from the quarters into absolute darkness. The cloud cover had thickened, pressing down like a weight, smothering even the faint glow that usually rose from the big house windows. Somewhere in that direction, Mr. Crawford sat drunk and desperate, but his lamps seemed unable to penetrate the night that had settled over the plantation like a burial shroud. Sybil led the way, her feet finding the path through memory more than sight. Behind her, the women followed in silence. 7 of them, moving like ghosts through darkness, their presence marked only by the soft sound of breathing and the whisper of fabric against fabric. The excavation site loomed ahead, darker than the surrounding darkness, a wound in the earth that seemed to pull light into itself. As they approached, Sybil felt the temperature drop, felt the air thicken, felt that familiar sensation of being watched by countless invisible eyes. The spirit lights were waiting. They ringed the excavation in a perfect circle, hundreds of them now, cold blue-green flames that cast no real illumination but made the darkness visible, defined its edges, gave it shape and substance. They hovered perfectly still, an audience assembled, witnesses to whatever would unfold. Among them, Sybil saw smaller lights, child-sized, lower to the ground. The ones whose graves had been disturbed, whose bones had been scattered, whose spirits had marked Caleb's back with their small handprints. They pulsed with a different rhythm than the others, faster, angrier, less patient. Sarah gasped behind her. Dinah's humming had stopped entirely, but they held their ground, standing 20 feet back from the excavation's edge, forming their own circle of witness. Sybil walked forward alone. Each step felt like moving through water, like the air itself had become resistant, testing her commitment. The ingredients in her pockets grew warm, then hot, responding to proximity to the thing that waited below. Her grandmother's voice rose in memory, steady and certain. When you stand at the threshold, child, you stand as more than yourself. You stand as every woman who came before, every ancestor who survived, every power that crossed the water in secret. You're not alone. You're never alone. The edge of the excavation appeared suddenly in the darkness, a drop-off into nothing. Sybil stopped with her toes at the rim, looking down into depths that seemed to extend far beyond physical possibility. The breathing she'd heard for 3 days was louder here, unmistakable, rising from below like the exhalation of something vast slowly waking. She knelt and arranged her ingredients in the pattern her grandmother's notes had specified. The clay jar of graveyard dirt at the north point, the silver dime at the south, Job's tears seeds at east and west, the lock of white hair at the center, Mr. Crawford's stolen strands laid across it in a cross pattern, the birch bark with its written symbols placed where her knees would rest, the knife she kept in her hand. The spirit lights pressed closer, their circle tightening. Sybil could feel their attention like pressure against her skin, like countless hands waiting to push or pull depending on what happened next. She took the birch bark and held it close to her face, reading the phonetic guides in the ghostly light. 3 days of practice. 3 days of shaping her mouth around sounds that belonged to the Choctaw language, to the departed people, to the ones who'd held this land for 1,000 years before treaties were broken and graves were violated. The words felt foreign on her tongue, dangerous, like speaking them might fundamentally change her throat's shape. But her grandmother had left clear instructions. The spirits will only hear words spoken in their own language. English is the tongue of theft. French is the tongue of trade. But Choctaw is the tongue of the land itself. Speak it respectfully, speak it true, and they will listen. Sybil began. The first syllable came out rough, uncertain. But as she continued, as she shaped the consonants and held the vowels, something shifted. The words seemed to find their own rhythm, their own music, flowing from some place deeper than conscious thought. Her grandmother's teaching, her grandmother's sacrifice, her grandmother's power rising through blood and bone to give Sybil's voice authority. She spoke the greeting first, the acknowledgement of the spirit's right to anger, their claim to justice. spoke of violation and desecration and the theft of peace from those who deserved rest. Her voice grew stronger, steadier, carrying across the excavation site and into the darkness below. The breathing from the depths changed rhythm, became listening rather than sleeping, became aware. Sybil continued, moving into the second part of the ritual. She picked up the knife and pressed its edge against her left palm. The blade was sharp enough that she barely felt the cut, just sudden warmth as blood welled up and began to drip. She let it fall onto the lock of white hair at the center of her arrangement, her blood mixing with her grandmother's essence, 2 generations of power combining, activating the working that had been prepared years in advance. The blood hit the hair and began to smoke, not burn. Smoke, as if the hair had become too hot to hold liquid, was transforming blood into vapor that rose in thin tendrils toward the darkness above. The smoke carried scent, iron and earth and something organic, ancient, the smell of roots deep in soil, of things growing in darkness, of power that predated cultivation. Sybil spoke the binding words, the syllables that meant close, seal, return to rest. Spoke them while her blood continued to fall, while the smoke rose, while the spirit lights pressed closer and closer until she was surrounded by a wall of cold flame. And from the excavation, something answered. Not in words, not in language, but in sensation. A pressure that built in Sybil's chest, a resonance that made her teeth ache, a vibration that started in the ground and traveled up through her knees, her spine, her skull. The thing beneath was responding, was considering, was measuring her offering against its hunger. The small lights, the children, surged forward suddenly, breaking from the circle, rushing toward Sybil like a wave of cold fire. She felt them pass through her, dozens of presences moving through her body as if she were smoke, as if she were doorway, as if she were the threshold they needed to cross. Each passage left sensation, small hands clutching, confusion, fear, the memory of being buried with care and ceremony. The violation of shovels breaking through earth, bones scattered, peace shattered, rage. Sybil gasped as the last child spirit passed through her and continued down into the excavation, returning to the depths, going home to disturbed graves. The adult lights followed, a procession of the dead flowing past her and descending, their anger not forgotten but acknowledged, witnessed, given the respect that had been denied. She kept speaking the binding words, kept her bleeding palm extended, kept the ritual moving even as the spirits flowed through her like water through a sieve. The pain was extraordinary. Not physical pain, but the psychic weight of so many dead moving through living flesh, leaving impressions, memories, fragments of themselves that would never fully wash out. But she held, kept speaking, kept bleeding, kept the door open just wide enough for the spirits to pass through and return to rest, while simultaneously preparing to close it before the larger thing, the guardian, the settler, the ancient presence, could push through from below. The last of the small lights vanished into the excavation. The adult spirits followed. The circle around Sybil stood empty now, just darkness and the faint smoke rising from her grandmother's hair where her blood continued to fall. Below, the breathing stopped. Silence, complete and absolute, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Then, from the depths, a voice, not speaking through Thomas this time, not using a borrowed mouth, speaking directly, the sound rising from the excavation like earthquake, like thunder, like the earth itself given language. The debt is not settled. The words weren't English, but Sybil understood them anyway. Understood them in her bones, in the marrow of her, in the blood currently smoking on her grandmother's hair. The one who owns must pay Mr. Crawford. The spirit meant Mr. Crawford, the man whose name was on the deed, whose signature claimed ownership, whose authority had ordered the digging that disturbed the graves. Sybil's voice shook, but she kept speaking, kept reciting the binding words, the phrases that meant enough, balance, justice served. argued in a dead language that the blood had been spilled, that Caleb had paid, that the spirits had been acknowledged. Not enough. The voice from below was absolute, implacable. The spirits had returned to their rest, yes. But the guardian, the thing that protected their graves, that enforced the ancient claims, it was not satisfied. Would not be satisfied until the one who owned the land paid in full. Behind Sybil, one of the women cried out. She risked a glance backward and saw them pointing toward the big house, their faces illuminated by a new light. Orange-yellow, hot, growing. Fire. The big house was burning. Not struck by lightning, not accident, but spontaneous ignition that started in multiple places simultaneously. The study where Mr. Crawford sat drunk, the bedrooms above, the kitchen, the parlor. The entire structure erupting into flame as if the earth itself had decided to purge what stood upon it. Through the windows, Sybil could see Mr. Crawford staggering, could hear his screams even at this distance. The flames weren't spreading like normal fire. They were seeking, hunting, following him as he ran from room to room searching for escape that the house refused to provide. The spirit wasn't taking him gently, wasn't granting the quick death of smoke inhalation. It was burning him alive, slowly, with the deliberate cruelty of something that remembered every violated grave, every broken treaty, every theft compounded over decades. Sybil should have felt horror, should have felt pity, should have wanted to intervene. But standing at the edge of the excavation with her blood still smoking and the guardian's presence pressing up from below, all she felt was the terrible weight of justice. Not mercy, not forgiveness, just the scales balancing themselves through fire and screaming. Mr. Crawford appeared at a window, his body wreathed in flames, his mouth open in a howl that carried across the plantation. Then he was gone, pulled back into the burning interior by hands that might have been flame or might have been something older wearing flame as camouflage. The screaming stopped. The big house continued to burn, but the hungry quality of the fire faded. It became ordinary flame now, consuming wood and fabric and the accumulated wealth of 3 generations of men who'd believed that paper and signatures made the land theirs. In the excavation, the breathing resumed, but softer now, satisfied. The guardian had taken what it was owed. Sybil spoke the final words of the binding, the phrases that meant sleep, rest, the door is closed. Her palm had stopped bleeding, the cut already beginning to scab over as if her body understood the working was complete. The smoke rising from her grandmother's hair thinned, dissipated, became nothing. The darkness in the excavation seemed to solidify, to become impenetrable, to transform from absence of light into presence of something else. A seal, a barrier, a door closed and locked. The warmth faded from the ground beneath her knees. The pressure in her chest eased. The sense of being watched by countless eyes withdrew. It was done. Sybil sagged forward, catching herself with her uncut hand, her body suddenly exhausted as if she'd been laboring for hours instead of minutes. Behind her, the women rushed forward, hands reaching to support her, to pull her back from the excavation's edge, to wrap her in warmth and presence, and the relief of survival. "Thomas," Sybil managed to say. "Check, Thomas." Sarah ran back toward the quarters. The others helped Sybil to her feet, steadied her while the world tilted and swam. She'd given blood, given words, given herself as conduit for the dead to pass through. The cost hadn't been paid in years of life. Not yet, not immediately. But she could feel it beginning. The slow drain that would compound over time, that would age her faster than calendars measured, that would take pieces of herself she wouldn't fully understand were missing until much later. The big house burned down to its foundation. No one tried to stop it. The slaves stood in clusters watching the flames consume brick and mortar and the physical manifestation of their bondage. Some wept, some prayed. Some simply watched in silence that held too many emotions to name. Sarah returned from the quarters, her face split in a smile of pure relief. "He's awake. Thomas is awake. The cold's gone." He's asking for water and his mama and saying he doesn't remember anything after walking past the excavation 3 days ago. Around Sybil, the women began to weep. Not from fear now, but from relief. From the release of tension held so long it had become part of their bodies. Dinah's humming started again, but this time it was a song of thanksgiving, of deliverance, of survival against odds that should have crushed them. Esther gripped Sybil's shoulder, her old hand strong despite its tremors. "You did it, child. You closed the door. You sent them home." Sybil nodded, too tired for words. She looked at the excavation site one final time. In the darkness, it appeared ordinary now. Just a hole in the ground, just displaced earth, just the normal violence of land being carved for human purposes. But she knew better. Knew that beneath the surface, the Guardian still waited, still watched, still enforced the ancient claims. The door was closed, but not locked forever. Disturb the graves again, violate the treaties again, and it would wake. Would always wake. That was the truth the spirits had taught her. The land remembered, the earth kept accounts, and eventually, always, the debt came due. Dawn came slowly, gray light filtering through smoke that still rose from the big house ruins. The slaves gathered in the yard, uncertain, afraid, waiting for someone to tell them what happened next. Mr. Crawford was dead. The big house was destroyed. The overseer was dead. The crops were ruined. Everything that had structured their lives, the hierarchy, the brutality, the certainty of ownership, had burned or been buried or been scattered like the Choctaw bones. They were still enslaved, still property according to laws written in distant capitals by men who'd never set foot in Mississippi. But the immediate architecture of their bondage had collapsed, and in that collapse was space, temporary, fragile, but real, for something else to emerge. Esther climbed onto an overturned bucket and addressed the assembly, her voice carrying across the yard. "Mr. Crawford's son lives in Natchez. He'll inherit. He'll come to assess the damage, to decide what to do with the land and us." Murmurs ran through the crowd, some fearful, some calculating, some simply exhausted. "That gives us time," Esther continued. "Time to decide who we are when he arrives. Time to organize. Time to make demands." She looked at Sybil, standing at the edge of the gathering. "Time to decide what we want to build on this land that's been paid for in blood. Ours and theirs and those who came before." More murmurs. These ones sounded like possibility. Sybil slipped away while Esther continued speaking, while the slaves began to discuss and debate and imagine futures that would likely be crushed when the sun arrived, but deserved to be imagined anyway. She walked back to the quarters and found Thomas sitting up on his pallet, drinking water, his mother holding him tight while tears ran down her face. "Miss Sybil," Thomas said when he saw her. His voice was hoarse but his own again, no trace of the thing that had spoken through him. "Mama says you saved me, says you stood up to the spirits and sent them back to rest." Sybil knelt beside him, touched his forehead gently. The warmth was normal now, human warmth, no trace of the clay cold that had marked him as claimed. "I just did what my grandmother taught me, what needed doing. She says there's a cost. That root work always costs. Too young to be asking such questions, too old not to deserve answers." Sybil nodded slowly. "There's a cost, but it was worth paying." Thomas's mother looked at her with gratitude and grief mixed together, understanding that Sybil had traded pieces of her own future to give Thomas his back, understanding that some debts could be transferred but never eliminated, only shifted from one ledger to another. "Thank you," she whispered. Sybil stood and moved to her own pallet, sat down heavily, felt the exhaustion crash over her like a wave. Her left palm throbbed where she'd cut it. The scab was thick and dark, and she knew it would scar, would leave a permanent mark of the night she stood at the threshold and spoke to the dead. Sarah brought her food. Dinah wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. Esther returned from the yard and sat beside her, saying nothing, just offering presence. They sat in silence as the sun rose fully, burning off the smoke, illuminating the ruins of the big house and the half-dead cotton fields and the excavation site that now appeared ordinary in daylight. Innocent, just a hole that would need to be filled before someone twisted an ankle. But Sybil would never see it as ordinary again, would always know what lay beneath, would always hear the breathing in quiet moments, would always carry the memory of spirits flowing through her, leaving traces of their grief and rage that would never fully wash clean. The cost her grandmother had paid, the cost Sybil had inherited, the cost she would continue paying until her own fever came, until her own time shortened, until she passed whatever power remained to the next generation and hoped they'd be strong enough to carry it. But for now, for this moment, she was alive. Thomas was alive. The spirits were at rest. The door was closed, and the sun was rising on a plantation that had been fundamentally changed, that would never again pretend the land was neutral, was ownable, was anything other than earth that remembered its dead and enforced its claims. Sybil closed her eyes and let exhaustion take her, and dreamed of her grandmother, standing in that overgrown garden, smiling with pride and sorrow mixed together, whispering, "You did good, child. You stood, you held. You were the wall. Now rest. The work is never done. But today, you rest." And Sybil did.